I disappeared the same night my land became worth killing for, the rain still pounding the tin roof of my truck as I crossed the county line with nothing but a duffel bag, a broken phone, and a deed folded so many times it felt like cloth, never imagining that 5 years later I'd be standing in a courtroom watching a judge order a Karen's dream house torn apart brick by brick because she built it on what she thought was abandoned ground but was actually still mine. The land sat just outside Ridgeway, 42 acres of scrub oak creek-fed pasture, and a ridgeline everyone ignored until developers sniffed profit in the soil, and I inherited it the hard way, through my father's sudden heart attack and a will contested by cousins who smiled at funerals and sharpened knives in private. I stayed at first, stubborn, sleeping in the old ranch house with its warped floors and bullet-scarred porch posts, dealing with surveyors trespassing by mistake, and HOA reps leaving glossy pamphlets on my windshield like threats wrapped in smiles. Then the pressure escalated. Zoning complaints that went nowhere, anonymous calls warning me I couldn't stop progress, a fire set in the barn that the sheriff ruled accidental while refusing to meet my eyes. The night I vanished wasn't dramatic in the way people imagine. No chase, no explosion, just a quiet realization that staying meant losing everything, maybe even my life, and that sometimes survival looks like surrender until the moment you can strike back clean. I left the land in a trust one never dissolved, paid the taxes through a shell account, and told no one where I was going, not even the friends who would have tried to talk me out of it. For 5 years I lived like a ghost, oil fields, remote construction jobs, cash pay, nights in trailers or cheap motels, watching Ridgeway from a distance through public records and gossip forwarded by a clerk who owed my father a favor. That's how I learned about the HOA forming on the edge of my property, about the woman who led it with a voice like a gavel and hair that never moved, about the permits filed that carefully danced around my parcel's legal description until one day they didn't dance at all. Karen, that was her real name, and the universe sometimes has a cruel sense of humor, became HOA president and decided my land was unused, neglected, effectively abandoned, words she repeated often enough that people stopped asking whether they were true. She filed quiet title actions with addresses she knew I wouldn't answer, posted notices where no one would see them, and when no objection arrived from a man everyone assumed was gone for good, she broke ground. The house rose fast, concrete foundation poured before the frost, framing up in weeks, stone facade shipped in from 2 states over, a wraparound porch that faced my creek like it had always belonged there. Neighbors applauded her vision. The county loved the tax revenue. The HOA newsletter ran photos of the progress with captions about leadership and courage. And through it all, I watched, patient, methodical, saving every receipt, every filing, every photo time-stamped and backed up twice, because I knew something Karen didn't. Absence isn't abandonment if the paper says otherwise, and paper is the only thing judges truly listen to. I came back on a Tuesday morning in early fall, parked at the edge of the property line with boots that still had oil field dust on them, and walked the perimeter while contractors stared like they'd seen a dead man. Karen confronted me at the fence, clipboard in hand, smiling the tight smile of someone used to winning by volume, and told me I was trespassing on community land. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I handed her a copy of the deed and watched the smile crack, just a little like ice under a sudden weight. That afternoon I filed an injunction. By Friday the site was shut down. By the end of the month the case was on the docket. And as I stood in the courtroom months later, listening to Karen explain why she believed my disappearance meant forfeiture, I realized the strongest hook of all wasn't revenge. It was proof, and I had 5 years' worth of it waiting to be read aloud. The day the injunction papers hit Karen's marble kitchen island, the house she'd bragged about for 2 years stopped being a victory and became a liability, and I knew that because people who build on lies always panic when the paper trail shows up uninvited. I didn't attend the emergency HOA meeting she called that night, but I didn't need to. 3 different neighbors texted me blow-by-blow accounts of her pacing, her voice cracking as she insisted it was just a formality, and the attorney she'd hired nodding too quickly while whispering phrases like procedural irregularity and curable defect, legal bandages slapped over a wound that was already infected. The next morning, Karen tried to intimidate me the only way she knew how, by overconfidence. She showed up at my temporary rental with a county deputy in tow, claiming I was harassing the HOA by asserting ownership of land I'd clearly abandoned, and when I asked the deputy if he'd like to see the tax receipts I'd paid every year without fail, his shoulders sagged like he'd been dragged into a losing fight. Karen pivoted instantly, accusing me of forging documents, of identity fraud, of trying to extort the community by threatening their beloved president's home, and I let her talk because every accusation she made without evidence became another brick in the wall that would eventually crush her case. Discovery opened like a floodgate, and what spilled out was breathtaking. Emails where Karen coached surveyors to adjust boundary assumptions, filings where she listed my address as unknown despite certified mail receipts proving she'd received notices returned unopened by design. Minutes from HOA meetings where members expressed concern about building on land with an unclear title and Karen overrode them with promises that her lawyer had handled it. My attorney, a quiet woman with a voice like steel wrapped in velvet, smiled for the first time when she read those minutes, because intent matters and Karen's intent was stamped on every page. Depositions were worse for her. Under oath, she couldn't explain why the HOA's quiet title action was rushed through during a holiday week, or why the notice postings were photographed once and then removed, or why she told contractors to ignore a man who showed up asking for proof of ownership, because he was probably homeless. Each answer contradicted the last, and the court reporter's fingers flew as Karen's confidence bled out sentence by sentence. Outside the courthouse, she tried to save face, telling reporters this was a misunderstanding fueled by a drifter with a grudge, and I stood 10 feet away saying nothing while cameras captured the contrast. Her rehearsed outrage versus my calm, documented reality. Neighbors began to fracture. Some apologized quietly, admitting they'd assumed I was gone for good. Others doubled down, angry at me for threatening property values, as if theft becomes legal when enough people benefit. The judge ordered a site inspection, and the day we walked the land together, Karen's house looked different, less like a dream and more like a mistake set in concrete. The foundation straddled my survey pins by 12 feet at the closest point, 23 at the far end, an error no professional could miss unless they were told not to look too closely. When Karen argued that moving the boundary would harm the community, the judge asked a simple question that landed like a hammer. Did you ask permission before you built? Silence followed, thick and unforgiving. Mediation was suggested, and Karen came in offering money, then more money, then a partial buyout that would let her keep the house and pay me off quietly. I refused every offer, not out of spite but because this was bigger than a number. Allowing her to keep what she'd taken would tell every future Karen that audacity beats ownership if you're loud enough. The courtroom days dragged on, testimony stacking up, the narrative sharpening into something undeniable. I didn't vanish to abandon my land, I vanished to survive, and survival doesn't void title. When closing arguments ended, Karen looked at me with a mixture of fury and fear, finally understanding that this wasn't a negotiation anymore. It was a reckoning. The judge took the case under advisement, and as we filed out, Karen whispered that she'd ruin me no matter how it ended. I believed her, because people like her don't accept loss, they escalate, and that's when I realized the verdict, whatever it was, wouldn't be the end. Would be the trigger. The verdict didn't arrive with drama, no packed courtroom or gasps from the gallery, just a quiet notice posted to the docket at 8:42 a.m. that read like a thunderclap if you understood what every word meant, because the judge didn't just rule in my favor. He dismantled Karen's entire narrative line by line and left her nowhere to hide. He found that I had never abandoned the land, that my continuous payment of taxes and maintenance through agents preserved my ownership beyond dispute, and that Karen's actions weren't mistakes or misunderstandings but a deliberate attempt to acquire property through procedural manipulation, which in legal terms is about as close as a civil court gets to calling something theft without handcuffs. He voided the quiet title action, invalidated the permits issued on its basis, and then came the sentence that made my attorney close her eyes for a second like she was savoring a long-earned moment. The structure erected on my land constituted a continuing trespass and nuisance, and the only adequate remedy was removal. Demolition. Karen screamed that it was impossible, that the house was her primary residence, that families would suffer, and the judge let her finish before explaining, calmly and without malice, that hardship created by wrongdoing does not excuse the wrongdoing itself. She appealed immediately, of course, filing emergency motions and seeking stays, but the record was too clean and her conduct too obvious. Each request was denied with increasing bluntness, until the appellate court refused to intervene at all. That's when the panic turned ugly. Karen blamed everyone, her lawyer, the county, the neighbors who failed to support her. And when none of that changed the deadline for demolition, she turned on me publicly, accusing me of revenge, of cruelty, of destroying a community over a technicality. I responded once, in writing with exhibits attached, and after that I said nothing because silence backed by evidence is louder than any press conference. The sheriff served the demolition order on a gray morning when the house looked almost peaceful, sunlight catching on the stone she'd chosen to impress people who would soon pretend they'd never admired it. Contractors arrived with equipment Karen had tried to block, and when she stood in the driveway screaming that no one had the right, the deputy read the order aloud while neighbors watched from porches that suddenly felt less secure. The first wall came down faster than anyone expected, a crack like a gunshot followed by dust and a collective inhale, and Karen collapsed onto the lawn as if the ground itself had betrayed her. It took 3 days to finish, and with each load hauled away, the illusion that confidence can substitute for consent disintegrated. When it was over, there was nothing left but a scar of disturbed earth and my survey stakes standing like quiet witnesses. Karen didn't stop there. She sued me for emotional distress, for loss of use, for everything she could think of, and each case was dismissed in turn, some with language so sharp it bordered on reprimand. The HOA fractured under the weight of legal fees and special assessments, members suing each other over who approved what and when, the unity Karen once claimed replaced by finger-pointing and regret. I fenced the land properly, restored the creek bank she'd damaged, and posted signs that didn't gloat or threaten, just stated the truth in plain language: private property. No trespassing. The last time I saw Karen in person months later, she looked smaller somehow, not because she'd lost weight or confidence but because the world had finally stopped rearranging itself to accommodate her certainty. She muttered that I could have taken the money and walked away richer, and I told her something my father used to say when deals smelled wrong: some prices are too high even when the number looks good. As the dust settled, I understood that the real victory wasn't the demolition or the judge's words. It was the precedent, the reminder etched into public record that disappearance doesn't equal surrender, and that land remembers its owner even when people pretend not to. And just when I thought the story was done, a final twist surfaced in the county files that would make the fallout even bigger, because Karen hadn't just built on my land, she'd done it more than once. The last revelation surfaced the way most buried truths do, not with a confession but with paperwork, when a junior clerk called my attorney to ask whether a newly filed survey should be cross-referenced with my case because the legal description looked uncomfortably familiar, and that single phrase detonated everything Karen had left standing. It turned out my land wasn't the only place she'd tested the limits of audacity. She'd made a habit of treating absence as consent, building fences that crept inches at a time, rerouting drainage, claiming slivers of neighboring parcels no one watched closely until the precedent of my demolition emboldened them to look. Once the pattern emerged, the county couldn't unsee it. Audits began. Permits were frozen. Quiet title actions Karen had pushed through years earlier were reopened, and suddenly the woman who once ran meetings with a gavel found herself fielding subpoenas from people who used to clap when she spoke. The HOA dissolved under a court-appointed receiver, its funds drained by assessments and refunds ordered to members misled by false assurances, and Karen's remaining properties, ones she'd sworn were clean, became collateral damage as lenders demanded clarity she could no longer provide. In a final hearing meant to close my case for good, the judge addressed the gallery as much as the parties, reminding everyone that property law is built on records and restraint, not bravado, and that communities thrive when rules protect the quiet and absent as much as the loud and present. My land was restored in full, damages awarded for the creek remediation and the months of lost use, and a permanent injunction entered to ensure no future board could repeat what Karen had tried. I didn't celebrate with champagne or speeches. I walked the ridgeline at dusk, listening to water move the way it always had, unchanged by 5 years of human noise, and felt the kind of peace that comes from seeing a long plan complete itself without shortcuts. Karen appealed again, then withdrew when her counsel explained the risk of sanctions and referral for further review, and after that she vanished from Ridgeway the way people do when the mirror gets too honest. The land didn't care. Grass returned where the foundation had been jackhammered out, birds nested where scaffolding once cast shadows, and a simple fence line, true, measured, boring, did the quiet work of preventing the next visionary from confusing desire with right. If there's a moral, it isn't about revenge or patience or even justice in the cinematic sense. It's about paper, persistence, and the long memory of ownership, about how vanishing doesn't erase what's yours if you keep faith with the facts. 5 years gone taught me that sometimes the strongest way to hold on is to let go until the moment you can stand back up with the record in your hands, because when the judge finally speaks, confidence collapses, concrete cracks, and the land goes back to who it always belonged to. I thought the case was finally over the morning a survey crew packed up and drove away for the last time, but that illusion shattered when a black sedan with state plates rolled up my fence line and 2 investigators stepped out carrying folders thick enough to bend. Because Karen's collapse didn't end with demolition. It triggered a chain reaction that reached far beyond Ridgeway and straight into places she never imagined her name would land. They told me calmly that my lawsuit had become a reference file in a broader investigation into fraudulent land acquisition tactics used by multiple HOAs across the county, tactics Karen hadn't invented but had perfected, and my case was now Exhibit A for how easily temporary absence had been weaponized against owners who couldn't be loud enough to defend themselves in real time. Subpoenas multiplied, banks froze accounts tied to shell LLCs Karen once bragged were just smart planning, and contractors who'd been paid to look the other way suddenly remembered conversations they swore never happened. Within weeks, Karen's former attorney withdrew from representation entirely, citing irreconcilable conflicts, and the same woman who once lectured neighbors about compliance now faced depositions where silence carried consequences. The county assessor recalculated values tied to illegal expansions, triggering tax reassessments and refunds that blew holes in municipal budgets, and suddenly officials who'd smiled at Karen's ribbon cuttings were scrambling to distance themselves from her shadow. I was called to testify again, this time not as a plaintiff but as a witness, explaining how disappearance had been mischaracterized, how paperwork had been manipulated, how confidence had substituted for consent, and as I spoke I watched jurors nod, not because they sympathized with me, but because they recognized a system that rewards certainty even when it's wrong. Karen never took the stand in the end. The plea agreement she signed sealed records I'll never see, but the public consequences were unmistakable. Licenses suspended, restitution ordered, a permanent bar from serving on any HOA board within the state. When the news cycle moved on, Ridgeway settled into a quieter rhythm, chastened, careful, and the land, my land, became a reference point, not for revenge stories but for cautionary ones told at county trainings and legal seminars. I built nothing extravagant there, no monument to victory, just a modest structure set well back from the creek, permitted twice over, surveyed 3 times for good measure, because winning taught me something losing never could. Ownership isn't loud, it's precise. On the 5th anniversary of my return, I stood where Karen's porch once faced the water and realized the strongest hook of the whole saga wasn't that a judge ordered demolition. It was that a man can vanish and still be present if he does the quiet work, keeps the record straight, and waits for the moment when truth doesn't need shouting to be heard.